Okay, so it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Leslie Rice. Leslie is an ecologist focusing on landscape ecology and biogeography with a main focus on butterflies. Her current research explores underlying mechanisms using laboratory studies of caterpillar growth and development based on different temperature regimens, and incorporating patterns originating from citizen science monitoring networks. Leslie's focuses on several facets of citizen science, including the use of these data to answer large-scale ecological questions, especially those related to climate and land cover. So I'm going to make you co-host, so you would be able to share your presentation. 1 second. Okay, so you should be co-host now and able to share the presentation or present your slides.
Can you guys
Yep.
see the screen?
Yes, we see it. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, well, I want to just start by first of all thanking you guys for the invitation, but even more, and I'll be thanking you throughout this entire talk because what I do wouldn't be possible without people like you, groups like NABA, and some of the other butterfly monitoring networks that I work with, and so I like to get that message out whenever, as loudly and consistently as I can. I will just say that we're kind of a small group here. Please jump in anytime. Feel free to ask me any questions at any time. You can raise your hand with your controls, but I may not see it. So feel free to just unmute and jump right in. Um, and I'm happy to answer any questions or get engaged in any kind of conversation, especially as we get to the end. If there's anything I didn't talk about here that you guys are interested in, I'm happy to talk about it. I always like to start these talks now with this important message that we are getting more and more evidence that insects as a group appear to be in decline globally. And it's not just the biodiversity of insects, and which we would also be very concerned, but just the overall numbers and overall biomass. And not only does that have incredible impacts for group like yours and me and other people in who work on these types of projects, who love butterflies, love going out and watching butterflies. It's an important part of our life, but also because there are so many important ecosystem services that we get from butterflies and other insects. And a lot of times that's not really appreciated, and it's not just the pollination. I think that a lot of people now are pretty familiar with the idea that insects help pollinate, but even more importantly, in my view, just by turning hard to digest plant material into delicious food for that can cascade up the food chain, give us a very rich biodiversity, break down uh, materials, cycle carbon and nitrogen, and all the different things that insects do. It's incredibly important. So, we live in a time of large scale insect declines, and it's really important that we figure out what is going on. First, by understanding the patterns that we see in these declines and also understanding the drivers. And even though butterflies are just one little tip of the moth branch, and that moths are just one of many groups of insects, the reality is that we have more information on butterflies, more monitoring data on butterflies than any other insect by far. And so they are our best resource for understanding this question in general. So what I'm going to be focusing on tonight is understanding the drivers of butterfly declines. I'm going to be focusing on the Midwest, and I'm going to be using data from many, many different citizen science or community science programs. But I'm going to start a little bit more broadly and talk about declines in general. So I have, let's see, for some reason my computer does not seem to want to advance. There we go. So I have three main takeaways from this talk. The first is that butterflies are declining in the US, and I'm going to show you lots of different evidence for that. Partially because I think it's important to just see how strong the evidence is as we've continued to analyze these data over the past several years. But it also gives me an opportunity to show you all the different kinds of monitoring data that are out there, not just NABA data, but other programs as well. And we're going to see how we have different lines of evidence because we're able to do similar analyses with completely independent data sets from several different groups. So again, number one, butterflies are declining in the US. Secondly, we're going to look at drivers. And I'm going to share research with you that is not yet published, although it's, in hopefully the final stages of review, that suggests that at least over the past 20 years or so, insecticides appear to be the primary driver of butterfly decline, at least in the Midwest. But that evidence is still preliminary and it's not published yet. And the last takeaway, and again, always one of my most important takeaways, is understanding these large scale patterns and drivers of butterfly and any other taxa, dynamics of any other taxa, is impossible. And I always like to say, not just hard, but impossible without citizen science programs like the one you guys run at NABA. So this is an overview of just how much butterfly data there is out there and the different types of data and how much we have both spatially, so like how well representative across North America is it, or America north of Mexico, and also what is the temporal scope of these data. So like how much data do we have at different points in time? So in our lab, we tend to separate this kind of monitoring distribution data into four groups. So we have the classic group, which is occurrence records, so like museum records from specimens, or now we have portals like iNaturalist, where people can upload a single, photo of a butterfly or other organism, and that becomes a record that that species was seen in that place at that time. And that's the most common type of data there is. In fact, that's probably always going to be the most common type of data. And you can see that up here. As of 2018, when this compilation ends, the majority of our records on butterflies are presence-only records, so 1.1 million records. And if you look over the last 70 years or 75 years, you can see for each year how many records we have of each type. So we have museum records, kind of peaked in the 70s and then started declining quite a bit. And as those collections declined, we saw an exponential rise uh, of these photos getting uploaded to iNaturalist, or people reporting sightings to eButterfly and other similar portals. I do want to note for the record, though, that only about 10% of museum records are digitized. So in reality, we're only seeing a tiny portion of the actual number of museum records. So as they continue to digitize those records, they're just going to grow and grow. So this is a really important and dense form of data, but the reality is that the types of analyses you can do with these presence-only data are very limited. So it's really only when you start getting formal surveys that you can do more nuanced analyses of what's going on with abundances through time, comparing, dynamics in one place compared to another. But even there's sort of a range of the strictness of different protocols. So greater than, more stricter than these presence only opportunistic records, but not quite as strict as something like NABA's count program, are field trip data. And I heard you guys, even organizing some of your field trips, and field trips, tend to be in a restricted area, like maybe a park. They usually report, but not always, report all the species that we're seeing there. And so these field trip data, which for NABA can include, like we call the sightings data, and some of the data in the Butterflies I've Seen database, field trip data, although not all of it is trip data. Some of it is just sightings data. And, for instance, the Massachusetts Butterfly Club, which is a NABA chapter, has very, very, a very strong field trip program where they go on lots and lots of trips every year. And they, generally report everything they see. And so that one state provides a lot of data. Then we have something like the NABA Count program, which is the largest and longest running butterfly monitoring program in the world. Longer than the UK butterfly monitoring system, which is certainly the most famous, and definitely way, way larger. And of course, that program has these count circles that started in 1975. There was a lot of growth, especially through the 90s when NABA first took over that program from Xerces. And since about 2000, it has kind of leveled off with about 500 counts that get done across the country, the US, Canada, and Mexico every year, which is a lot. Those are a lot of count circles. And then finally, we have these structured survey programs, things like the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network or the Ohio Butterfly Monitoring Network, where they recruit volunteers to survey individual transects or routes that are set up very much like an academic survey. And those are usually surveyed multiple times per year. They have a restricted search window, and they record everything they see. And it's usually just one person, and it's the same person running these routes over and over. So in a lot of ways, these are the most rigorous survey data and the data we can do the most with, but they usually are much more regionally restrictive. And it just so happens for historical reasons that the vast majority of these routes are in the Midwest. And so you can see that down here. And if you look at the rest of the US, it's kind of like a big white space with not very many surveys in it at all. So if you think about these different types of surveys from presence only data to what we'll call counts and this middle ground and structured survey, what you find is that as you go from presence only to structured survey, you get less and less and less data, but you have a little bit more information packed into each data point. And so we tend to be able to do the most rigorous analyses on the structured survey data. 1 second, I'm just gonna, sorry, little phone alarm going off. And so these are the data that we use in my lab. I work with NABA data, I work with these structured survey data and these Pollard surveys. And we've been working for the past 20 years to get these surveys digitized and then, make them through each of the data owners, make it possible so people who are interested in doing analyses can get hold of these data. And what you can see is that if you look at the number of papers that have been published through time, that we're seeing this general increase. Now, these are all programs. I didn't split it out for just NABA, but I can tell you that most of these papers are based on NABA data. NABA is still the most, one of the most widely used data sets. And if you look here, you can see that this is when I first started working on the digitization of NABA data back in 2005. And looking at the number of papers that came out, this first bar is from 1995, which was the first paper published using NABA data by Anne Swengel, up to 2004, that there had really only been 5 papers published. And now you can see through time that, we're seeing more and more papers getting published every year, so that, in this last year, 2023, we had 8 papers published that we know of just in that 1 year, as opposed to this 20-year time period. So we are seeing a much greater use of the data. And the purple versus orange is papers that are associated with my lab in purple, and papers that are not associated with my lab in orange. And the reason I think that's really important is I actually like to see more and more papers coming out that do not involve my lab. Like, I want, as I've worked with these data, to me, a sign that all of these programs that I've worked on with NABA and these other projects, the more they're getting used by lots and lots of different groups, that's showing that the community is really kind of adopting those data and seeing the importance of the data. So this is kind of an overview of all the different kinds of butterfly data we see in the kinds of analyses that I'm going to show you. So before I move on to the questions of butterfly declines and drivers of those declines, does anyone have any questions about these data sources or anything about, like, any of the data coming out of these programs? Okay. So now I'm going to move on to this question of, are butterflies declining in the US? And again, jump in anytime. And so I have a couple of goals in going through several papers. This is actually all the papers that I'm aware of that do at least a regional scale analyses looking at butterfly declines. And the reason I'm going through all the papers is, A, there aren't that many papers, but also it shows a couple of things. One, these, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these analyses are done using different data sets. And the more we see similar patterns with independent lines of data, at least for me, the more confidence I have in that pattern that I'm showing. So I'm going to be pointing out, the different regions, the different analyses, but I'm also going to be highlighting the different data sets and how we're seeing a lot of the same trends from the same data set. So this first paper that I want to highlight is this paper that came out in 2021 in Science, published by Matt Forrester and colleagues, including Jeff Glassberg, based on 3 different sources of data. The first is Art Shapiro's transect that he has been surveying since 1972. He goes back to these 11 sites every other week, and he's been doing it again, for over 50 years. So that's one data set. The second data set is the NABA data set. So these are all the NABA counts in the Western US that have at least, I think, 20 years of data or 15 years of data. I can't remember the cutoff. And then the last one here is the iNaturalist data set. And you can see exactly what I was talking about earlier. So the Shapiro data are structured surveys, and there's just this one transect across, this elevational gradient in Central California. Then we have the NABA data, which covers the entire Western US, but is still relatively sparse compared to the INAT data because, all people have to do to, participate in this program is just upload a data point. And so we have our 3 types. We've got structured surveys, NABA counts, and presence only data. And the colors here are showing you the elevations of each site. And so it's just showing you at least that each of these 3 programs is capturing sites across the different elevational gradients in the Western US. And then these bar charts on the right are showing you the results of the analysis. And each one of these bars is a number of species. And along the x-axis, it's showing you the trend. So these gray bars to the left of 0 are species that are declining. So you can see anytime that there, is a higher density of gray bar than there is of white bar, it means more species are declining than increasing. And all of these are showing similar stories, that if you look across these different data sets, they're all showing that while some species are increasing, the majority of species appear to be declining. So any questions about this data set?
Leslie, each of the bars in those charts, each one is an individual species?
So each one is a category of how much it's declining. So if it's right here where the gray and the white mix, these are the bars that are closest to 0. So the number on the x-axis is how much they're declining per year. And the bigger the magnitude of the number, the more they're either increasing or declining. So what this is showing is that the majority of the species are actually showing no change. But as you go farther and farther out, you're seeing species that are having steeper and steeper declines. So in this case, looks like I assume you guys can see my cursor. About 70 species are showing very slight declines, whereas, maybe 3 species are showing extreme declines. And then on the other side, for each one of these bars, it's telling you how many species are experiencing each kind of level of decline. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yes, thank you.
Other questions? So another thing you see, I kind of already made these points, but again, these are the most rigorous types of data that we can do the best analyses on. These are the least rigorous, and then the NABA counts are kind of in between, but they, are the largest scope that are actual surveys. But, the important thing is that all of the data are showing similar trends. These are coming from the Midwest. So these are declines in Illinois and Ohio. The top figures come from a study published based on the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. This bottom one comes from the Ohio Butterfly Monitoring Network. Every single one of these programs does a slightly different, or every single one of these papers does a slightly different type of analysis, whereas here they're showing you the number of species that are experiencing each level of decline. Here, they're just showing you how the total species richness or the total population size is declining over time. And in Ohio, they put all the data together in all of Ohio, whereas in Illinois, they broke it up into different regions. That's why you have so many points. But the important thing is that both of these published studies showed declines of total population. And in the case of Illinois, they showed a decline of species richness as well. So here is another study. This is off of NABA data. And this is shown for basically all of the northeastern quadrant of the US, the total abundance of butterflies. This isn't published yet, but it's in press, so it'll be coming out in Functional Ecology soon. And here we broke up the abundances by what stage they overwintered by. So if they overwintered by as eggs, it's in purple; as pupae, it's in green; and as larvae, it is in blue. And what you can see is that all three groups are declining, but species that overwinter as eggs seem to be declining the most sharply. And this shows another really common factor that people like to look at when they're looking at declines, which is there something about the species traits that can help us understand, which species are most likely to be declining and which species may be increasing or, not declining as sharply. Up here, we're just showing you where the surveys came and how much data we have through our study region. But again, this is NABA data. So it's, the same data set here as the first paper, but of course, this paper is in the West, this paper in the East. Any questions about this study? Okay, so now these have been regional analyses. So now I'm going to skip to continental scale studies. So the first study is a study that's based entirely on NABA counts. So this is a paper that was published recently in Global Change Biology. And again, Jeff is a co-author on this paper. And what this is showing is, based on the NABA counts, how much the total abundance of butterflies is changing throughout the US. Colors in blue are indicating increases, whereas colors in red and yellow, all the way up to sort of greenish yellow, are indicating declines. So what this paper is showing is that, throughout most of the US, the lower 48, the trends are more tilted towards declines than they are towards increases, but there do appear to be a couple of regions where increases are occurring. But the steepest declines are in the Southwest, and you can see that just really starkly here. And in fact, just in general, other than the Pacific Northwest, we just see pervasive and the most stark declines in the Western compared to the Eastern US. And this is likely related to drier areas. This part of the coast is wetter than the rest of the West. So that, could be part of what explained that. And if I flip back to this original paper by Matt Forrester in the West, they also did some follow-up analyses that suggested that drought was potentially the most important factor driving these butterfly declines. So we're starting to see some consistency. So these are the papers that are either published or are accepted for publication using the NABA data and some other data sets. So already we have some pretty persuasive evidence that we appear to be seeing declines throughout the US. However, there's kind of piecemeal. Each paper used a slightly different data set or a different data set. They used a different analytical approach. And so it makes it a little hard to compare between papers. So now I want to share with you results that are currently being written up to be submitted that come out of a really big workshop that's taken place over the last couple of years in Fort Collins, Colorado. And this is the status of butterflies in the US working group. So the goal of this group, of which many, many people are part of, is to pull all the data together from as many different sources as possible and do analyses from regional to continental, and look at these potential declines or the trajectory of butterfly populations in the US. And one of the really important factors is, even though we're pulling together lots and lots of different data, which normally you would analyze one data set at a time, they used a single unified analysis that pulled together all the NABA data, all of these Pollard structured surveys, and conservation-focused single species surveys, from agencies and other sort of smaller scale programs. And so we're getting ready to submit this to science. And so again, this also is unpublished. It hasn't gone through peer review, but hopefully soon it will be, out there in the world. So first of all, here are all the data points. They're all colored exactly the same, no matter what survey they come from. And the first thing you can see is how different the density of data is in different parts of the country. But importantly, once we pulled all this data together, we had a total of 13.5 million butterflies counted across 92,000 surveys and 35 monitoring programs. So this really is the most comprehensive study that has been done on butterfly declines in the US. A lot of these data come from these Pollard programs that I've mentioned already. I've also mentioned the Illinois and the Ohio programs, but there are lots of these Pollard programs throughout the US, and you can see kind of them highlighted here. And usually when you're looking at this map, so I'll go back, the places where we have the darkest, densest points are places where we have these smaller scale projects. So we have these butterfly monitoring networks. Here we see a huge sort of increase over Massachusetts, and that's because of the Massachusetts Butterfly Club. Some of these programs, even if they're statewide, they have kind of a limited scope, but you can kind of see the different programs that exist and how, at least in a very sort of regional or local areas, we get this incredible butterfly density. If you look outside of these regions, almost all of the rest of this data is NABA data. And one of the things that's really just incredibly useful about the NABA count program, separate from these Pollard programs, is that it links together the patterns in all these different programs. So in these purple boxes, these are the places where we have overlap between these regional butterfly monitoring networks and the Pollard networks and NABA counts. And then in a lot of the US, all we have are NABA counts and NABA trip data. So in order for us to look across the entire US, in a lot of ways, we're really leveraging the NABA data, and we use these other data sources to help us kind of look at the dynamics in smaller scale areas, and then we can extrapolate those out, but leverage the NABA data to do that the most rigorously. Another thing, though, to notice, and I'm going to back up again, is that some regions of the country are just much better represented than others. And so the Midwest actually has the highest density of butterfly surveys anywhere else in the country. And the Mountain Prairie region has the fewest, and then there's a range of data densities that go across these other 7 regions. So if we look at all of these data put together across all of the US, what this is showing is that the mean number of butterflies seen in each survey is declining through time as you go from the year 2000 to the year 2020. In fact, we see a 22% decrease in total from the number of butterflies from the 2000 to 2020. And one way to think about that is that for every 5 butterflies you would see on average in the early 2000s, you would only see 4 butterflies now. And in a lot of ways, I think kind of that sort of way of framing it can help people really understand what is lost and what has been lost in terms of the butterfly community. Does anyone have any questions about this figure? Because I know this has kind of been a lot in terms of pulling all these different surveys together.
Yeah, I have a question, Leslie.
Sure.
What people are studying other insects, as you mentioned. I wonder if you could just say what they've seen so far. Is it comparable to this?
It's kind of really surprising how consistent the data are for different taxa in different parts of the world. And of course, there's a lot of variability, but it's really typical to see 2 to 4% declines per year, with overall declines between 20 and 40%, over the past 20 to 50 years. But we don't have as much data for other insects groups as we do for butterflies. So butterflies tend to be the most rigorous analyses, but the results we see even across taxa is pretty similar. But there's a lot of variability. There have been tons of studies looking at insect abundance changes, and there is variability. And that's why this issue of declines is still a bit controversial, not as controversial as it was even 5 years ago, because as people were noticing this, there was a huge uptick in the number of people who have started pulling together these data sets and looking at the overall abundances. And as people have done that more and more, we're seeing pretty similar results.
What about people that are studying plants? I mean,
Not nearly enough people study plants. Like, I would say that, wow, plants probably have the least amount of like this kind of distribution data. I mean, they definitely show declines in certain plant ranges, but even that is more usually because of land use changes and in some cases invasive species. And studies that actually look at year over year population changes for plants are pretty rare.
Yeah, okay. I thought so. I'm just curious. Like butterflies obviously are intimately um, dependent upon plants and vice versa here. So
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, when you think about how do we understand the drivers, which is what I'm going to talk about next, it's really hard to do an analysis that takes like host plant into account because we don't usually have host plant data.
yeah,
Even for monarchs, which have received the lion's share of the analysis and the emphasis and coverage, we don't really know what is going on with milkweed populations across the country. We don't have data on it. We just know like how many areas have been started using Roundup ready crops, and so we just assume that the amount of milkweed has gone down in those landscapes, but we don't have, for the most part, we don't have actual milkweed data. Does that,
yeah.
even for that, I mean, they're trying to collect it now, but it's hard. Any other questions?
Thank you.
So before I move on, I want to talk a little bit about regional trends because, as I said, we, separated the U.S. region into 7 different regions. These are based on the U.S. Forest Service regions. Here I'm showing you an analysis across all 7 regions, but we also separated it up into these different regions. So we have the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific Southwest, the Mountain Prairie, the Midwest, the Southeast, and the Northeast. So whatever region you care about the most, if you keep that in mind, here are the results across these different regions. This figure here is showing you the total abundance, and overall, it's what the average percent annual change is. And remember how I said, like in general, it tends to range between 2 and 4% for many of the analyses that came out. That was also true in this analysis. And you can see that, these metrics by the different regions are ranging really from about 1 to 4%. This is all butterflies combined. But if you look at trends by species, this is kind of similar to what I was showing in that first paper by Matt Forrester, but it shows it to you a little bit differently. And so what you see is the number of species on the x-axis, and if it's to the right of the 0 line, these are the number of species that are increasing, and to the left, the number of species that are decreasing. The darker colors are ones that are showing declines that are statistically significant, whereas the lighter color is showing declines that are apparent but not statistically significant. So we call those possibly declining. The green are ones that basically show little evidence that they're changing at all. Like it doesn't appear to be a statistical issue. It just shows that they just appear to be totally flat. And then you can see on the other side, the numbers that appear to be increasing. And if it's darker blue, it's statistically significant. If it's lighter blue, it's not significant. So we're just saying that it appears that they're possibly increasing. And an important point is that we see species that are increasing and see species that are decreasing, but there are more species that are decreasing rather than increasing. And I'm just going to flip back to this first paper. That's exactly what we showed here. The gray bars are the number of species that are decreasing. The white bars are increasing, we see both decreases and increases, but we see more declines than increases. So sorry, I'm flipping back and forth here, but all of these studies are really looking at the same thing. So every single study I've shared with you so far is just looking at entire communities, right? Either the total abundance, the richness, or, the abundance trends by species, but it doesn't tell you anything about individual species. And I know people care about individual species, and that's certainly true for a group like yours, where you're very kind of aware of all those different species and you encounter them and recognize them, whereas for a lot of audiences, they don't know a cabbage white from a West Virginia white, so to speak. And so we do have trends by species, and I don't really want to spend too much time here, but this paper did sort of break it down by species. You can see among the about 250 species that we looked at, these are the ones with the starkest declines and increases. And so one of the things that I'm just going to mention without going into a species by species list here is that we always know there are winners and losers. We're starting to see pretty consistently that there are more losers than there are winners when it comes to these declines we're seeing in the butterfly community. But one of the things that helps us understand the difference between like which species might be winning species and which species might be losing species is to think about species traits. And I'm not going to do that here, but that's kind of the next big step we're taking with this project is we're parsing these down by the individual species, and then we're looking at if we can use species traits to kind of understand why we see certain species behaving the way they are. Any questions before I sort of move on to the next sort of topic, which is drivers of decline? So, and I see it's getting later, so I don't want to keep people on too much. So I'll try to go through this kind of quickly. But, when we think about what might cause insects to decline, we have to think about all the different ways that we're changing, the world is changing and changing very quickly in the last 100 years. Of course, the environment has always changed. Certain species have always, like some increased and decline. We've had 5 mass extinctions long before people came along. But when we think about this most recent period of decline, which has really been the last 50 to 100 years, we want to think about all the different things that are going on. And so we know that there's climate change, which is changing storm intensity, fires, droughts. We have land use change, where we have deforestation, agricultural intensification, urbanization. We've got pollution, including nitrification. We've got introduced species. And you can imagine that the degree to which all of these things are going on, that it's really hard to tease apart these different factors. So that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is that these factors have different levels of importance through time. So as time goes by, you see things changing more. So like land use changed much more starkly back around the turn of the 1900s, whereas climate is changing much more starkly at the turn of the 21st century. And so one thing to think about as you're moving forward is that we're going to have these multiple environmental factors impacting these insect trajectories, that the relative importance of each is changing through time. And that a lot of previous studies, including the studies that I just showed you, have, to the degree to which they've looked at this issue, they've found climate to be the most important factor. But the time frame of their study also overlapped with a period where climate was changing the most. So if we're really interested in this question, we kind of have to think about things on a slightly longer time period. So this is actually showing you different factors related to anthropogenic change, and it goes back in time over about 200 years. And so if you just look at the population density in the US, you know, from the 1850s up to the 2010s, you know, you can see not only this great increase in population density, but how this increase in density moved west along with European colonization. As that happened, we had land cover change. So if you look back at, you know, the amount of land converted to cropland, you know, in the major time before European settlement versus this time of European expansion, yes, we were having, you know, land converted to cropland, but it really picked up, you know, post 1850s. And in the, you know, West, we had this loss of grassland, where in the East, we had this loss of forest. And then after all the trees were cut down, we actually saw pretty stark reforestation from 1920 up until the present day. So if you're thinking about land cover change, it's not just a question of like, oh, when did land cover change the most? It's more sort of nuanced than that. Depending on the time and the place, you have different types of land cover changes. You know, and a lot of these land cover changes are tied to agriculture. So in addition to just taking land and converting it to land that is now in agricultural production, you also have different agricultural practices. So, you know, most of the way that we were farming the land before 1920 was almost completely manual, you know, and dealing with things like weeds and pests, you had to manually take care of that. You had to pull the weeds out. You had to, you know, kill the pests or, you know, slowly kind of put out some sort of, you know, natural insecticides. Whereas then we started getting crop dusters, and then we started getting much more technological advancements, including genetically modified organisms. So if you look at this kind of history of agriculture, you see manual to more industrialized, and then to sort of modern technologies taking over. Then we have changes in climate. And interestingly, if you look at the mean annual temperature, you know, back from the 1870s up to now, like you really kind of have to squint to see these changes. Yes, it has definitely gotten warmer over time, but you know, the temperature hasn't changed nearly as much as the land has changed or agriculture has changed. But if you think about like the last 10 years, we've seen this incredible acceleration of climate change. And, you know, temperature tends to be a little bit more moderate in how it changes over time, compared to rainfall and drought. And so this is just showing you 3 different snapshots in time and what the drought index looked like. So this is what, you know, was maybe a normal time back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. This is showing you the height of the California drought that occurred, you know, not anymore, but back in the early 2010s. And this here is the height of the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And so this kind of gives you a sense of how much, you know, precipitation will change through time. So if we think about these major factors, we've got land cover change, we've got agricultural practices, and we've got climate. And one of the hardest things to do is to take all of these factors into account in a single analysis. And none of the studies that I've shown so far have done that. It's actually really, really hard to do that, to take all of these major factors into account in one unified analysis. So that is the last study that I'm going to share with you, where we have done that in the Midwest to try to understand, what appears to be the relative contribution to recent insect declines in the Midwest. So 1 second. Let's just go past all of this. We're going to look in the Midwest. That's where we have the highest density of surveys, butterfly surveys. And because we have the highest density of surveys, if you look at this confidence interval, this is actually the smallest confidence interval. So that means that we have the most confidence in the estimate of decline in the Midwest compared to all the other regions of the country. In addition to that, the Midwest is a center of global crop production, a center of agriculture. So it's another place where it's really a good place to look and try and see if we can figure out what are we going to learn from these different types of forcers. So that's what I'm going to share with you next. And so this is a paper that is a revision is in review. So hopefully this will be published soon. Okay, so really quickly, before I go into this, I have to talk a little bit about pesticides, because one of the hardest things of grappling with this question of like, well, how much do pesticides contribute to insect declines is that there are so many different kinds of pesticides. We have pesticides that are focused on weeds. We have pesticides that are focused on insects. We have pesticides that are, target very specific plants or are very broad. We have them, different pesticides or herbicides that you have to, either apply multiple times in the season. You can only apply it once. There are insecticides and herbicides that you might apply just in response to a pest or a weed outbreak, whereas others are prophylactic. So you use them year after year after year, regardless of what the pest or weed landscape is looking like. And that issue of prophylactic versus reactive spraying or use of pesticides turns out to be a really important factor, because even though we've been using pesticides and herbicides for a long time, it's the genetically modified ones that have really allowed us to use them prophylactically. So even in the past, when people weren't really focused on biodiversity, they didn't spray insecticides every year because spraying insecticides was expensive. So they only wanted to spray insecticides when there was an outbreak of pests, in general. So this issue of whether or not it's prophylactic versus reactive. There's another issue of how persistent the chemical is in the environment. So does it dissipate and break down quickly, or does it change? These are all the different factors, and there are lots and lots of different technologies. And the other thing that's really hard to grapple with is that pesticides have been in use since people have been doing agriculture to some extent. They've used natural pesticides. Now we've moved into more chemical and artificial pesticides. But the reality is that as different pesticides come on the market, it's not like people just start using a pesticide. It's that they replace what they were using before with something new. So that makes it even harder to sort of make sense of pesticide use. And so I'll just use the example of neonicotinoids. Now, they've been around for a long time, and in general, they're overall toxicity has been shown to be low, but it's with the advent of seed coating that now neonicotinoids are deployed prophylactically. So you buy these seeds, every year you buy seeds that have the seed coating on it. The coating leaches into the soil and then is taken up by the plant tissue of other non-target plants. So neonicotinoids, even though it's, put on the seed, it actually is not very well targeted. And you can contrast that to something like BT treated corn seeds, where there's this virus that impacts LEPs that are now built into the genome of corn. But the reality is that for the most part, that poison stays within the plant tissue of the corn, and it is very targeted towards species that eat corn. And that does not include, butterfly species. So, as we're thinking about all these different groups, we have to understand that their use changes through time. The characteristics of these chemicals is different among different groups in terms of how widely they're targeted, how often they're applied, and how persistent they are in the environment. So that's another thing that makes it really hard to study pesticides. And so it's been the kind of factor that's been left out of a lot of these analyses of insect declines. And so when people would say, what's causing the insect declines? Sometimes people would say, oh, well, it's probably, land use change or climate, but they couldn't really say because it was really hard to do an analysis that also included pesticides. So this analysis includes pesticides. We grouped all the pesticides into 6 broad classes. So 2 different types of weed control, and those are ones that are glyphosate and non-glyphosate. And of course, for people who are familiar with Roundup Ready crops, once that was available on the market, all of a sudden we could spray those herbicides more widely. So you see this increase in glyphosate use throughout the 2000s. And this was actually much starker in the 1990s, but our study doesn't include the 1990s. So that's a really important factor. As the use of glyphosates increased, the use of non-glyphosate decreased until we sort of come to this inflection point here, which is caused by the evolved resistance of weeds to glyphosate. So now we see this sort of break point at around 2008. In terms of insect control, we sort of separated them into these reactive and prophylactic groups. And for the prophylactic groups, we have the BT corn and the neonicotinoids. And what you can see here with the neonicotinoids is they didn't really come on the market until about 2003. And then you see this rapid increased use, and that leveled out only about 7 years later in 2010. BT corn was growing more slowly, and that leveled out at around 2006. So these are, and in terms of the other insect control, there are just 2 different types, and people have been spraying those for a while, and they haven't really changed that much over time. So these are kind of good things to keep in mind as we move to the next part, which is like what appears to be causing the decline of butterflies in the Midwest. Does anyone have any questions about these different classes of pesticides? Okay. So the methods we use are we do these analyses by looking at changes in the environment in each county year. So our unit of replication is each county for which we have data in the Midwest in each year. Okay. So The darker the color in the county is the more number of survey years. We have 60 counties for which we have data. And this figure on the right is basically just showing you for each of those counties, like when the surveys stopped and started. So some of the surveys, go back to the beginning of our study period, which is 1998, and goes all the way to the end, which is in 2014. So this is just kind of giving you the background that, we have different amount of data for each county. We have different amounts of data about these different usages through time. And because of that, it's actually really hard to just look at that overall decline and say, okay, butterflies have been declining 2% per year for the past 20 years. What caused that? And so what we do is what we call a space for time substitution, where we really just look at each individual county year. And so for each individual county, we say, in that county compared to last year, how much land what was lost, how much did the temperature change, and how much did pesticide use change? And so we can track that for every single county and every single transition from one year to another within counties. So for some counties, we have a really long period, but for other counties, it's a short period. But the important thing is that, as long as we have 1 year of data, we can look at these transitions over time. So, I'm not going to go into details about the analysis, but what we're trying to figure out is for each of our factors that we're looking at here, we're looking at species richness and total abundance. And we also looked at monarchs just because monarchs are of particular interest. We asked for our 6 different types of pesticides, 3 different types of land cover, which is forest, urban, and cropland, and then 6 different weather factors. GDD is basically just a proxy for temperature. So basically what this is saying is like temperature in the early part of the year, temperature in the middle part of, this is temperature in the spring, temperature in the, early summer, early to midsummer, and temperature in late summer and early fall. And same thing for precipitation. For any change in temperature, precipitation, or land cover, or the use of these pesticides, how much does species richness or total abundance change? When a point is to the left of this line, it means that butterflies are declining. To the right, it means it's increasing. If the point is filled in, it means that that factor is statistically significant. If it's not filled in, you can see that there might be a trend, but it's not significant. So what this is showing, if we just look at species richness, what this means is that, and each one of these lines is the effect if you assume all other factors are held constant. So basically what this means is, if you can assume that everything else on this list is held constant and all that's changed is the use of glyphosate, which is Roundup, as you increase the use of glyphosate, this is showing that species richness goes up. Now, that's kind of a surprising result. It also shows that total abundance is creeping up and even monarch numbers are creeping up. So this seems really surprising. Neonicotinoids, on the other hand, as you increase the amount of these seed-coated neonicotinoids, species richness is declining, total abundance is declining, and monarchs are declining. And you can do that for each of these factors. And what you see in these results is that it's really hard to make sense of what's going on, because things are kind of, not only are they all over the place, but looking at every single one of these rows, you have to imagine that every other row in this figure is held constant, and that never happens in nature. And this is kind of one of the big problems of looking at these kind of results, is it's hard to sort of make sense of this. What does it really mean in terms of how species richness has changed over time, how total abundance has changed over time, or how the number of monarchs has changed over time? And so there's an emergence of a new class of analyses that takes the metrics that come out of this analysis that I'm showing you here and puts it into what's called a counterfactual. And a counterfactual does something similar, but in a way that makes it a little bit easier to make sense of what's going on. And so what it does is it assumes that the first year, which in our case is 1998, it assumes that if everything else was held constant, the only thing that was changing was climate, in this case, GDD, together, or GDD alone, and precipitation. What do we think the butterfly population would look like? This didn't actually take place, right? Because everything was changing in different ways throughout the whole area. But if we could imagine that everything were held constant, the pesticides, the land use, everything were held constant except the weather, this is what we expect the butterfly community to do. So what it's basically showing you is temperature has the biggest impact from year to year on species richness, total abundance, and monarch numbers. And we kind of know that's true, right? As people who go out and observe butterflies from year to year, if we think of a good butterfly year versus a bad butterfly year, we're usually going to tie that with the weather. And that's what this is showing here. It's like, in any particular year, whether it's a good year or a bad year, it's really driven by the weather. So good years and bad years are due to the weather, but it's not explaining any trends through time. So overall declines in butterfly numbers through time do not appear to be explained by the weather, even though what this is showing is that the weather explains a lot of the variability. Now, if we look at, oh my goodness, you know what? Let me go out and pull you into a different screen, because the main takeaway, I actually pasted the wrong figure in that, and I really apologize. So one second. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then this really is my last slide. I really apologize for this. Let me just go to the correct. No. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So this is the last figure, and this is doing the exact same thing. It's showing a counterfactual, but instead of showing climate and temperature and precipitation, it's actually showing herbicides in the first column, insecticides in the second column, and then the combination of insecticides and herbicides in the third column. The first row is species richness, the second row is total abundance, and the last row is monarchs. And what this is showing is that, you know, if I'm just going to zoom into the insecticides, is that the only thing that's really explaining declines in anything are insecticides. Like herbicides basically don't explain anything for monarchs. They seem to suggest that there was a decline and then an increase in abundance, and an increase and then a decline in species richness, but that it's all kind of a wash over our 20-year study period. Whereas if you look at insecticides, it seems to be driving a decrease in species richness, a decrease in total abundance, and a decrease in monarchs. And interestingly, this decrease seems to really be initiated in 2003, which happens to be the year that neonicotinoids came on the market. So, based on this analysis, which again is just one analysis, insecticides seem to be more important than climate. I haven't even mentioned land cover because land cover doesn't come out as important at all. Insecticides seem to be the most important drivers of butterfly declines in the Midwest. They have done analyses on butterfly declines in the West, butterfly declines in Europe, bumblebee declines in Europe, bumblebee declines in the US. Neonicotinoids do seem to be the factor that often comes out as the most important. Now, I will say that this study here that I just showed you is the only study that takes all three factors into account: land use, temperature and precipitation, and pesticides. And not just, and all pesticides, like all of the pesticides were included in this analysis. We just put them in 6 different classes. So I think this is the most comprehensive analysis anywhere in the world that has been done on the, what seems to be causing declines in any insect. And our results suggest that it's insecticides. And among the insecticides, the neonicotinoids seem to be the most implicated. So one more point I want to make. You'll notice that this study stops in 2015. So 2014 is the last year of the study. That is because they stopped reporting neonicotinoid data in 2014. So this analysis that I've showed you is impossible past 2014 in the US. It can't be done because we no longer have neonicotinoid data to include in this analysis. So if we wanted to do a similar analysis in the future, we could take into account everything except for the one factor that, at least over this 20-year period or 17-year period, seems to be the most important.
Leslie, one quick question, Leslie. Who reports the neonic data that you use? Or who you?
Okay, that's a great question, and I'm going to stop sharing now because basically I'm done. So the neonic data has been reported by industry in the past. So there's actually a big industry database that gets done every year, and that's done based on questionnaires that go out to farmers. So every year, industry asks farmers about the treatments that they use. And you can buy that industry database, which usually ecologists can't do. Our team bought that database for $100,000.
Wow.
Okay. Now, I didn't do that, obviously. I'm an ecologist. I can't afford anything. But this was a collaborative project with agricultural economists who buy those databases every year, and that's just part of their academic research programs. But in 2014, they stopped asking people about seed-treated neonicotinoids, so they still collect all the other data. And those data are kept in very granular form by this company called Kinetic. But they've also started sharing that data in coarsen form with the USGS. So now you can get sort of coarser data than we used for this analysis by the USGS, and that's available free to the public. And I will also say that the Biden administration even had the Biden administration had planned to scale back tremendously on the number of pesticides that were included in that public database, and a huge outpouring from the scientific community and others as well actually caused them to rescind that. So we literally, in the past few days, found out that the Biden administration has shelved that new rule.
Yeah, well, that's going to end soon. I have a question. Has anyone done any long-term studies on butterfly abundance and preserved land where there may not have been any pesticide application to see whether there's similar declines?
So we did not do that here. I do think people probably have done analyses like that on very small scales. And one of the problems with doing this analysis in the Midwest is that there aren't really any preserves that are very far away from these crop fields. So that makes it difficult. But I do think in general, they're able to show that, communities in preserved lands tend to be more resilient than outside. But I think it's actually really hard for them to be able to say why that is. Is it because they're in better habitat, or is it because of pesticides? Because, when I was presenting this, I was like, land use doesn't come out as important at all. But of course, land use didn't change over the 17 years of our study. And we didn't specifically look at, butterfly communities in preserved, more natural habitat versus, more modified habitat. And if we did, which many, many studies have done that, they almost always show that natural habitat has better populations, but we tend to assume it's because of the habitat, not because of other things going on. And it would actually be pretty hard to tease that apart. You'd have to have a really long time series in the same place, which we do have in some places. So it's not like those analyses can't be done. It's just hard.
Well, the precipitating, as I understand it, the precipitating study for this whole insect apocalypse event, if you will, was the one in Germany, which was done on preserves over 30 years and showed 70% decline in flying insect biomass, I think it was. So, that's pretty, that was
pretty stark. Now that was 2 years, right? So one of the things that study,
2 years.
It was a snapshot 70 years ago and a snapshot now. And so I'm not diminishing like the story that came out of that, but one of the hard things is that when you just sort of pick 2 years out, if one is a high year and one is a low year, like you're going to see that same pattern. And so that study that precipitated all of this is, has shown that those trends have been seen over and over and over again. But yes, one of the things that was so disturbing about that study is it was in a natural habitat. But again, because it was just 2 snapshots in time, it's hard to know if, 1 year was just like a good insect year and the other was a bad insect year.
It was over 60 different preserves. It wasn't just.
It's true. It was over 60 different preserves. And again, I don't want to minimize the impact of that study. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, I see what you mean by its limitation.
Hard to tease apart all the different things that could be going on.
I mean, it was good in that it got everybody excited.
It got everybody interested. Again, I don't want to dog that study at all. And I have no doubt that, that they were showing something that was very real. It's just that if you want to try to tease apart, like, was it the natural habitat? Was it the climate? What was it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. And also, I haven't looked at that study closely enough to know, like, how isolated were those habitats. I mean, we know that, climate change is going to impact, species no matter where they are, right? Preserves don't help with climate. A lot of these insecticides get leached into the environment, and so that can also go into preserves. So it's like you want to try and take all of those things into account. So I think we really just don't know.
I have a question about the Pollard counts.
Yeah.
Do they do any vegetation sampling on those counts?
Some of them do, but none of them have used those vegetation surveys in any analysis because we don't have a system that can ingest those plant data. So the person who would want to do that would have to go and process and curate all of the plant data in order to do that analysis. Now, we have a proposal that we're about to submit to NSF that would allow us to do that for the entire butterfly community. So we would do all that curation in collaboration with all the different directors of the Pollard programs, and then make that data available to the public. So contact NSF and tell them to fund our.
Yeah, we have a lot of pull.
Any other questions?
But I just want to point out that a big problem for us who have butterfly gardens and we do our little bit for nature is that you've been talking about neonics in crop plants, but they're widely used to grow ornamental and pollinator plants for people to plant in their gardens. And those things are just, they're systemically full of neonics for years. It's hard. If you go to a nursery and say, oh, do you grow your plants with neonics? And then you get a blank stare at best, usually, because usually they don't grow their own plants right there. And
right.
It's really hard to find that out. It really is.
Yeah. And I think, this is one of the things that we've learned in terms of BT plants and systemic neonics, is that in terms of the impact on the pollen and the nectar, it's probably minimal. So in terms of things that you're planting in your garden, that's going to be more important for host plants than for nectar plants in terms of butterflies. But in terms of the environment, where they're growing, where they have these big nurseries, that's going to be leaching out into the larger environment. And the other thing is that you can't even trust whether or not it says organic. Matt Forrester has a great paper where he went out and looked, he collected all of these plants, and some of them were organic, and he did a tox study on all of the plants. All of them had some sort of pesticide on them. All of them. Most of them had multiple pesticides on them, and some of them were so-called organic plants. So it's like there's really nothing we can do. I mean, you can do your best, and I don't want to go political, and I try to stay away from politics, but I will say, to me, regulation seems to be the only way you can actually have, any sort of level of knowledge about what chemicals are infecting the environment. And I think the big takeaway from my perspective, I've been working in this area of research for many years. And I feel like this study that I just presented on the Midwest is the most important study I've ever been part of, because I don't feel like it's the last word by any stretch of the imagination. And I really hope that lots of people come along and do lots of similar things in lots of different places, to build on the studies that already exist outside of ours. But I do feel like there's this wisdom that's kind of, this story that's emerging, that it's really about the pesticides. If you think about, and I think about this from a first principles standpoint, right? Like, yes, invasive species. Let's put that aside for a moment and just think about the three biggest drivers of biodiversity change. That's land use change, which is often associated with invasive species, climate, and pesticides. We're looking at decline. Most of our evidence of declines are over the past 20 years, because that's where we have the most data, the most butterfly survey data, right? If you look at the NABA data, even they sort of increased a lot, and at about 2000 they sort of evened out. So there's this 20-year period or 24-year period where we have this really good signature of butterfly surveys. Well, what's been going on in those 24 years, right? Land use change happened a long time ago, so it's not going to explain declines over the past 20 years. Maybe it would explain, certainly would explain declines, that occurred in the, between the 1800s and the 1900s, but not in the last 20 years. Climate isn't going to really explain the changes that I showed you, because our study stopped in 2014, and climate change was actually pretty minor directionally. Like, it was way more important from year to year. Now, the last 10 years, every single year has been hotter than the last. And like the 7 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 10 years. But we also don't have neonic data for those 10 years. So if we wanted to do the same analysis that I just showed you and include those 7 hottest years to say, okay, well, now where is climate coming out? We would have to do that analysis without the neonic data, because they stopped collecting it in 2014. So there's this problem that really in the US, the only time we have all of the data available to us is really, the late 1990s through 2014, and so, all we can say is about, like, the only thing I can tell you is that from 1998 through 2014, pesticides seem to be the most important factor, insecticides in particular. Before 1998, it could have been glyphosate, right? Glyphosate came on the market in the early 1990s and had topped out by about 2000. This study showed that glyphosate wasn't important. If anything, it was maybe a little helpful, although I don't really believe that result. But the reality is that for the most part, glyphosate didn't change during our study period. So it's really hard to pick out, factors that aren't really changing. Same thing with land use. Like, land use was basically exactly the same in 1998 that it was in 2014. So we can't really say anything about land use. All we can say is that it wasn't important during that 17-year period. And so this is why it's so hard to study these issues, because it changes through time, and the data we have available is also constantly changing through time.
Do you think that if you had done a study for the Southwest, where agricultural intensity is less and climate increasing temperatures seem to be much more, that you might have gotten a different result?
Yeah, I mean, and Matt Forrester, looked at the drivers and he found it was mostly due to climate, but there would be that one, the valley where they do all the agriculture is the second most intensive crop area, and where Matt has looked in those regions, neonics come out as being very important. But we don't have as much butterfly data in the San Fernando Valley, right? Whereas it's kind of odd in the Midwest, and this to me is 100% because I don't know if you guys know who Doug Tarrant is, but he's the guy who started the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network. He patterned it after the UK Butterfly Monitoring Network, and then he sort of became this evangelist for butterfly monitoring networks. So that's why Ohio started, and then Michigan started, and then Iowa started. And so in this incredibly agriculturally rich area, we also have the highest density of butterfly monitoring studies anywhere else. And we don't have that in the intensive agriculturally rich region of California. So we can only look kind of outside of those areas where we have urbanization and climate change. So yeah, it's not impossible to look at that in California, but it's not as easy as it is in the Midwest.
Very interesting, for sure. Thank you for all that work. I can't even imagine how much work all this was. Oh my.
I didn't do. I mean, first of all, that status of butterflies in the US, that's like 25 scientists all working together. And then the study that I just showed you, I did work on that a lot, but it was mostly, done by a graduate student, Brandon Van Dyne-Zee, and, as part of his dissertation. So, I mean, all of this is impossible without huge collaborations, and that includes, collaborations with the people who are collecting the data, like NABA and all the different NABA chapters. Like we would have nothing to analyze if it weren't for the data that you guys are collecting.
I wonder if there's any, our club in particular, New Jersey Butterfly Club, we're very active in posting recent sightings throughout the year. And I don't know if there's any role for that kind of information in that kind of data, if you want to call it data.
Oh, it absolutely is data. We use that kind of data all the time, and I don't want to minimize that data because it's incredibly useful. It's hard to use it to track trends through time, but it's incredibly useful to look at changes in phenology. It's incredibly useful to look at changes in ranges. So for what we're showing today, it's not as useful. But I assume that your recent sightings goes up on the NABA sightings website.
Jim?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it can be gotten. We save it all.
So I mean, those data did not go into the analyses that I showed you, but they have gone into other analyses for which they are very well suited.
Right, because there's a lot of data from repeated visits to the same site many times during the season, year after year. So somebody could parse something out of there probably.
Right, and actually, if those are reported in a way that it looks like people reported everything they saw, we actually call that a field trip and not a sighting. We think of sightings as different from field trips. And so sightings are also really useful, but we think of sightings as like, oh, I saw one butterfly there, even though your sightings database is more comprehensive in that it includes both sightings and what our group would call field trips.
I think ours would be field trips because almost everybody reports everything they see and the numbers that they see. And weather conditions, etc.
Right, and we totally see that in the sightings data. So we call the sightings data field trips, and the field trip data can be used to look at trends over time. It's a little bit harder, which is why people haven't done it as much, but we're sort of moving into this world now where people are doing integrated analyses, pulling together as many data sets and data types as they can. And so that's why I think the NABA sightings data, you're going to start seeing that being used more and more in analyses. And it is super helpful. And the nice thing about it is that it's not like the counts are organized, like someone has to put them together. Whereas a field trip, you guys can just go out with a bunch of your friends and then just report it to the sightings website. And so it's easier to get coverage across a season. So that is a very nice thing about those data.
I think one thing too, Sharon, is that's why I like it if people put down the amount of time they spent at place too.
Yeah, we always try to do that.
Which is really useful, but we can use that data whether or not people report it. We can use it a little bit more powerfully when we have that piece of extra information.
Very good. Thank you again.
Terrific, Leslie, thank you.
It's wonderful.
Thank you, guys.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I was like, I feel like, oh, this is there's so much I want to share with them. So I was, I didn't want to be too overwhelming, but I really wanted to get across, like, first of all the different ways your data are being used, but especially like insecticides, especially, like, maybe it's not that surprising. Insecticides are killing insects, but and I think it's important for people to know.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Leslie.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a
You're
great
welcome. My
presentation, and
pleasure.
We're glad to have you here.
Bye-bye.
Ted,